Next up, we have Dr. Terry Rauch, who's the current Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Readiness Policy and Oversight, and also the Director of Medical Research and Development for Deployment Medicine and Force Health Protection. He has more than 35 years of experience in many facets of the military health system and has held numerous senior-level positions in the Army and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rauch.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm gonna, as I go through this briefing, I'm gonna take advantage of the audience and all of your brilliant minds to help me, because I need help, and as I go through this, I'll show you where I need some help. Well, right now, I need some help in moving this. So I think, there we go. All right. Well, that's my job, is to advise my assistant secretary, who's basically kind of the chief medical officer for the Pentagon. As you heard before, our R&D is a part of my portfolio, and with respect to the different topics or major programs, the major investments we have in R&D, it's largely combat casualty care, so you can think of that as basically acute trauma care. Military infectious diseases, so you can think of that largely as malaria, dengue, diarrheal diseases, anything that any endemic infectious disease that will affect our deploying force into that area. Military operational medicine is another major program. That has a very broad number of subtopics to include psychological health, PTSD, for example, suicide prevention, suicide intervention, physiological health, and physiological resilience. So things that we look for there is largely work and performance, military performance in environmental extremes, heat, cold, altitude, cold and altitude, and how do you protect and enhance performance in those various environmental extremes. Also, as a part of that, we're looking at nutritional interventions to maintain or enhance performance in various types of environments. And then the last major program that we have is on rehabilitation and regenerative medicine, and that's obviously largely focused on wounded, ill, and injured service members. I will say, though, that we have a significant investment in looking at that part of our force that is non-deployable. So we have a pretty sizable amount of the force that can't be deployed for a number of reasons. And a big reason is because of medical conditions. And probably one of the biggest medical conditions that limit deployment is musculoskeletal injuries that occur largely during training. So that's another major emphasis for us. So in the Department of Defense, we're really good at planning for operations, and the operations that we plan for are are very broad in scope. So as you can see, over on the left, over on your left side of that diagram, basically for the last 2 decades of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, we've largely been engaged in a low-intensity kinetic, low-intensity counterinsurgency operation. That in and of itself has, as an example, has produced a lot of casualties, a lot of acute trauma care, and for the most part, a large focus of that acute trauma care has been on hemorrhage control at the point of injury. If we can get a casualty within 60 minutes, quote the golden hour, right, back to definitive care, what we call roll 2, we can save 90 to 95%, and that's what the data for nearly 2 decades have shown. We will lose greater than 85% of our casualties at the site of injury because the nature of that warfare is that those are catastrophic injuries. They're non-survivable. But those that are potentially survivable basically bleed out because we can't control the hemorrhage. So a major focus of our combat casualty care program is on resuscitation fluids and techniques, and also hemorrhage control. A lot of casualties that were potentially survivable that we lost was because of truncal, non-compressible hemorrhage. But I will say that we've demonstrated over the last nearly 2 decades of war in our medical response. We've in Iraq and Afghanistan, we've demonstrated that we can do that. Okay, we save 90-95% once they get to roll two care. What we plan for is not another Iraq and Afghanistan. What we plan for is more towards your right, and that is what we plan for is a greater volume of casualties, a greater intensity of conflict and kinetic warfare, and we plan for peer-to-peer competition. And so that in and of itself is going to force us to think more in terms of prolonged field care, because we will have on the battlefield contested environments. We're not going to have a golden hour anymore. Casualties that we get to, we will probably have to hold, hence prolonged field care. We'll probably have to hold in place and deliver care to for hours, days, because we may not have air superiority or even ground access to evacuate casualties. So those are the things, those are my problems, right? So those are my problems. I need help in thinking about those problems. I need help in how do we empower a combat medic on the battlefield in that type of potential environment. How do we empower him or her to deliver care to a high volume of trauma casualties that will also include burns? And how do we use artificial intelligence and autonomy to deliver that care? Okay, that's kind of the a graphic of care on the battlefield. I talked about point of injury and the fact that if we can get somebody to a battalion aid station or Role 2 care, we can save the majority of them. That is just more of a graphic that kind of tells you at a very high level how we think about our medical R&D issues and how they apply to the force and the deployed force. And I've got 20 seconds to spare, I think. So I look forward to your questions.